On July 13, 1966, a horrific crime occurred in Chicago, Illinois, that would shock the nation and define one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, Richard Speck. Hello folks, today on Behind the Date, we will look back at a crime that shocked the nation, committed just because someone was unhappy with his life. In this video, we will talk about Richard Speck, the killings he did, and the aftermath. Warning everyone, this video won't be easy to see. The night started off as a typical summer night for the 9 student nurses living at the townhouse on Chicago's South Side. Little did they know that their lives would soon be changed forever. That night, Richard Speck, a 24-year-old ex-convict, broke into the townhouse. He was armed with a knife and had a plan to rob the townhouse, but clearly he had more in his mind. Once inside, Speck tied up the 8 women and systematically proceeded to beat and kill them one by one. He even proceeded to rape the last victim. Speck killed by either strangulation or stabbing. By the end of the night, 8 of the 9 women were dead. The 9th woman managed to survive by hiding under a bed, escaping the deadly eyes of Richard Speck. The police arrived on the scene the next morning and were horrified by the carnage inside the townhouse. They knew that it had to be someone insane, someone who didn't grow the way normal humans do, someone with a very dangerous mind. And they were not wrong. Richard Speck was all of that, but why? Richard Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois on December 6, 1941. He was one of the youngest of 8 children born to Benjamin and Mary Speck. Richard was particularly close to his father, and so when he died when Richard was just 6, it affected him deeply. But that's not all. After the death, Richard's mother remarried to an alcoholic and abusive stepfather whom Richard despised. Richard soon became known to be a troublemaker and was often in trouble with the law. He was often in fights and had a history of stealing and drinking alcohol. He also had a reputation for being a bully and was known to be cruel to animals. In 1960, Richard moved to Dallas and got a job at the 7-Up bottling company. During he got into a relationship, but just after 2 months of dating, his partner got pregnant and they got married. In 1963, Richard was arrested for forgery and burglary and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was released after 16 months, but within a week he was arrested again for wielding a knife at a lady outside. He was again sentenced to 3 years, but due to an administrative error, was again released in just 6 months. After his release, Richard soon got divorced and struggled to keep a steady job. He became more like a drifter, who you would most likely find in bars, drinking heavily. He also became heavily involved in the drug trade and was known to use and sell various drugs. He also became increasingly violent and got into fights frequently. Frustrated overtook Richard Speck, and after another failed attempt at getting a job at the Chicago dockyard, something gave in. A decision was made. On July 13th, 1966, Richard Speck would enter the townhouse and commit the most heinous crimes known to humankind. After the murders, Speck fled the scene and managed to evade capture for 2 days. He was soon identified by Klaus Lunsford, who recognized him from the police sketches and had seen him at one of the hotels he was drinking in. But before police could reach the hotel to investigate, Speck had already attempted suicide in his room and was rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, another surgeon recognized him and finally, the police had come to arrest him successfully. Speck was soon taken into custody and questioned. He denied any involvement in the murders, but police were more or less unfazed by it because they had solid eyewitness accounts to back the facts. He was charged with 8 counts of murder and was held without bail. Speck's trial began on April 3, 1967, and it didn't take much time for the prosecution to make a compelling case. There were fingerprints match and, of course, the eyewitness testimony of the only surviving victim, Corazon Amurao. Within just an hour, the jury found Speck guilty of all 8 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to death. Speck's sentence was eventually commuted to 8 consecutive terms of life imprisonment. He spent the remainder of his life behind bars and died of a heart attack in 1991. Speck spent the remainder of his life in prison, and his mental state was subject to much debate. Some experts suggested that he was mentally ill and that he had a personality disorder characterized by antisocial behavior. Other experts argued that Speck was more of a psychopath and that he was fully aware of his actions and the consequences. In the years leading up to his death, Speck had become a completely different person from what he was. With drug usage rampant in prisons, Speck was still dependent on drugs and used sexual favors in order to procure them. He still showed no sign of remorse and, on the contrary, was quite boastful about his violent deeds. The murders were also widely covered by the media, and Richard Speck quickly became one of the most infamous criminals in the history of the United States. His name entered the public consciousness, and he became a household name in the United States and around the world. In the years following the murders, Richard Speck became something of a celebrity, with numerous books and films being made about him and his crimes. His name became synonymous with terror and violence, and he became a figure of fascination for people who wanted to learn more about the depravity of human nature. Although Richard Speck is no longer alive, his legacy lives on in the form of his celebrity status. His name is still remembered by many people, and he has become a cautionary tale of the potential for evil lurking in the hearts of men. Also, if you are interested in more such videos, check out our previous video on the honeymoon killers.